One weekday morning in 2005, Gabriela Ortiz Herrera stood in her small kitchen in Boston, Massachusetts, stirring a pan of scrambled eggs. She stepped away from the stove to grab a stack of plates from her cabinet, and then she set them on the table just as her oven started to beep. She turned off the oven and pulled out a tray of biscuits. After setting the biscuits down to cool, she paused to take a deep breath and sip her coffee. For Gabriela, the last few days had been really hectic. Some of her relatives were visiting from the Bronx and New York City, and while Gabriela's 5-year-old daughter, Camilla, loved having her 4 cousins and her grandmother around, hosting the extended family was a big job, especially in their very modest apartment. Gabriela stirred the eggs until they finished cooking. Then she turned off the stove, set all the food on the table, and called to her family that breakfast was served. Gabriela's nieces and nephews came barreling down the stairs, followed closely by their grandmother, Maria, who was so young and energetic that she could keep up with the kids. And then a long moment later, Gabriela's 5-year-old daughter, Camilla, came down after them. Gabriela watched her daughter walk down the stairs very slowly and gingerly, keeping one of her small hands on the railing as if she were trying to steady herself. The little girl made it to the bottom of the stairs and slowly walked into the living room, but then she accidentally bumped into the coffee table and started looking around as if she didn't even understand that she had walked into the table. Gabriela asked her daughter if she was okay, and Camilla looked up at her mom with tears in her eyes, and she told her mom that actually her head hurt so much that she wasn't hungry. And then suddenly Camilla was sobbing, saying that she wished her head didn't hurt all the time. While her relatives filled their plates, Gabriela squatted down next to her daughter and wiped the tears away from her cheeks. For the last few months, Camilla had been complaining that she had a headache almost every single day. At first, the pain did not seem that bad, so Gabriela figured her daughter was just tired or maybe dehydrated from playing so hard, and so Gabriela had just given her daughter water and over-the-counter medicine, and Camilla did seem to get better. But in the last few days, Camilla's headaches had gotten so bad that they were making her cry like this, and now she wouldn't even eat because of her headache. Gabriela turned around to her extended family and explained what was going on with her daughter. She said she had to take Camilla to the hospital to get her headaches checked out. Camilla's grandmother insisted on going with them, and that meant that all the cousins would be coming too. So all the family pushed their food aside, and they all packed into Gabriela's car and headed towards Boston Children's Hospital. About half an hour later, Gabriela helped her little daughter onto a bed inside of the pediatric emergency room. The walls of the room they were in were painted with all these colorful images from popular children's books, but the cheerful decor did not seem to make Camilla feel any less miserable. The only thing that helped her was the fact that her dad, Joel, had shown up at the hospital too. Gabriela had called him at work, and he had left early to come be with the family. Little Camilla sat with her father, Joel, on the hospital bed and leaned her head on his shoulder, while a nurse brought in extra chairs for the large family. Gabriela had already told the nurse about Camilla's headache symptoms, and now they were waiting for an ER doctor to come examine her. A few minutes later, a tall, thin man in a white coat entered the room and shook hands with Camilla's entire family. He introduced himself as Dr. Arthur Patton and then turned to Gabriela and asked her to tell him about her daughter. Gabriela said that normally Camilla was the super high-energy kid. She wasn't in school yet, but she was very bright, and Gabriela and Joel read her books almost every night before bed. Camilla was also very close with her entire extended family. She actually stayed with her grandmother Maria in the Bronx in New York every other month, and then stayed with her parents the rest of the time. Maria was still in her 40s, and she was virtually co-parenting Camilla as well as her cousins in New York, which was a tall order. All the kids were young and totally rambunctious, except for little Camilla, ever since she developed these headaches. Gabriela explained that Camilla's pain seemed minor at first, but it had gotten worse over time. Camilla said it felt like somebody was squeezing her head really hard, and that where it hurt most was behind her forehead and eyes. Gabriela said that it appeared like the pain seemed to fade whenever Camilla was busy, but it never really went away. Dr. Patton nodded and asked Gabriela if her daughter had any other symptoms that concerned her. Gabriela said that actually yes, recently, in addition to these headaches, her daughter had seemed clumsier than normal. She would bump into things as if she wasn't seeing them, and once when she was eating, it was like she couldn't figure out how to use her fork during dinner, which totally didn't make sense. But Gabriela admitted that, perhaps her daughter was kind of teasing her with the silverware thing, but she really couldn't be sure. Dr. Patton made a note of this. Then he asked if little Camilla took any regular medications, and her mother said no. Sometimes she gave her daughter over-the-counter pain medicine, but that was it. Dr. Patton nodded. He said headaches were common and usually went away on their own. But the fact that Camilla's pain had lasted so long and become so severe was concerning. Plus, her clumsiness could be a sign of a neurological problem. Gabriella's stomach twisted with anxiety, and she started worrying that she had waited too long to bring Camilla to a doctor. She knew she must have looked terrified because Dr. Patton quickly assured her that little Camilla was almost certainly fine. They just needed to perform a quick physical examination to make sure. Camilla's father, Joel, helped Camilla sit upright while the doctor checked her vital signs. He tested her pulse, blood pressure, and temperature, and felt along her scalp and temples for sore spots. After that, he shined a small light into her eyes to make sure her pupils dilated correctly, and then Dr. Patton stepped back and told the parents that their daughter seemed normal. But Camilla was obviously in a lot of pain, and so the doctor said he didn't want to send her home quite yet without making absolutely sure she was okay. So the doctor offered to call in the hospital's neurology fellow, who had just finished his medical training, for a second opinion. Gabriella eagerly nodded. She still felt nervous, but she was thankful that Dr. Patton was doing everything he could to help their daughter. About 30 minutes later, a well-known pediatric neurologist named Dr. David Urian entered Camilla's hospital room. Dr. Urian was an old, kindly man with gray hair, glasses, and a bow tie, and he had been at his office at nearby Harvard Medical School when the neurology fellow had called him and said they had this puzzling case at Children's Hospital. There was a 5-year-old girl suffering from chronic headaches, clumsiness, and confusion, but her physical and neurological exams both looked normal. The fellow had asked Dr. Urian to come over and see if he could figure out what was going on with her. And so now, Dr. Urian saw Camilla's mother, father, and extended family standing around Camilla's bed, watching her anxiously. Dr. Urian introduced himself and said hello, and Camilla's relatives nodded and waved, but the little girl herself didn't even acknowledge him. She just stared down at her feet, looking scared and uncomfortable. The neurology fellow, who was very clean-cut and looked to be about 30 years old, handed Dr. Urian a copy of Camilla's medical charts and briefed the older doctor on what they knew so far. Dr. Urian said he wanted to start by doing another neurological exam. The fellow stayed in the room to observe while Dr. Urian went to Camilla's bedside. Now that he was standing over her, Camilla looked up at him and blinked several times. The doctor asked her for her name and birthday, and she answered both questions correctly. Next, Dr. Urian asked Camilla to push with her arms and legs against his hands, and when she did, she seemed strong. Then he asked her to walk around the room, and she didn't have any problems balancing. When she sat back down, he told her to close her eyes. Then, he touched a tuning fork to her arms and legs and asked her to tell him where she felt the cold metal. Again, Camilla answered correctly. Finally, Dr. Urian shined a small flashlight into the girl's eyes, and her pupils dilated normally, just like Dr. Patton had seen earlier. However, the neurologist wasn't actually looking at Camilla's pupils. He was looking behind them, into the very back of her eye, at an area called the retina. Dr. Urian carefully examined the tiny blood vessels in Camilla's retinas. Normally, the blood vessels deep inside of a person's eyes pulsate at the same rate as their heartbeat, but Camilla's were not pulsating at all. Dr. Urian had only seen this a few times before, but he knew retinal veins stop pulsating when a patient has an unusually high amount of pressure inside of their skull, often from some kind of an injury. To him, this was an obvious sign that Camilla was not suffering from typical headaches. More likely, she was in agony because she had suffered a serious head injury at some point and had brain swelling or bleeding, or possibly she could even have a brain tumor. Dr. Urian didn't want to alarm Camilla's family, so he quietly excused himself and asked the neurology fellow to join him in the hall. And once they were out there, Dr. Urian quietly explained what he had seen inside of the girl's eyes. Then Dr. Urian went back into the room and told Camilla's family that he wanted to get a better idea of what was happening in Camilla's head by performing what's called a CT scan, which is a type of X-ray that creates detailed pictures of a patient's internal organs. Camilla's mother, Gabriella, looked very nervous and overwhelmed, but she said okay, and so Dr. Urian called the radiology department to order the scan. Less than half an hour later, Camilla's CT scan was finished, and Dr. Urian strode down a hallway, test results in hand. He had reviewed the black and white images of Camilla's brain, and he didn't see any evidence of swelling, bleeding, or a tumor, which was a good sign. But he didn't know how to square these results with what he saw inside of the girl's eyes. Dr. Urian feared that Camilla had a neurological problem that didn't show up on the CT scan. He knew CT scans didn't capture literally everything, and it was possible Camilla had some kind of hidden tumor or abnormality that was causing these symptoms. But Dr. Urian also knew that brain tumors in 5-year-olds were incredibly rare, and so there was no reason to make Camilla's family panic until he had a more definitive diagnosis. So he planned to choose his words very carefully. Then he turned a corner in the hallway and opened the door to Camilla's room to speak with her family. When Gabriella heard the door open, she was sitting on the bed with Camilla's head in her lap. She watched her daughter blink at the sound of the door opening. Then Gabriella looked up at Dr. Urian and forced herself to smile, hoping her daughter would not see how truly afraid she actually was. Dr. Urian told Camilla's family that her CT scan results appeared normal. And right away, Gabriella immediately felt relief wash over her. Her forced smile suddenly became genuine. But Joel was not smiling, and neither was Camilla's grandmother, Maria. Maria asked the doctor what this meant for her granddaughter. If Camilla's CT scan was normal, then why did she keep getting these headaches? Like, what was going on here? Dr. Urian admitted that he was still trying to figure that out. He said he wanted to do another type of scan called an MRI with contrast. This was a much more advanced imaging technique than the CT scan, and it required doctors to inject Camilla with a special dye to make the image of her brain sharper and easier to read. The procedure could also be tricky for kids. Camilla would have to lie very still inside of a long tube-shaped machine that made a lot of loud noises. When she heard this, Gabriella suddenly was scared again. She felt like there might be something the neurologist wasn't telling her. Otherwise, why would he keep making her daughter undergo more tests? But Gabriella did not argue. She just said okay, and she watched the doctor leave the room. Then Gabriella looked down at her daughter's head in her lap, looking so small and so vulnerable. She gently brushed Camilla's long dark hair behind her ear and wondered what doctors could be looking for inside of her head. About an hour later, Dr. Urian and a whole medical team huddled around a computer screen in the radiology department to examine the results of Camilla's MRI with contrast. One doctor used a mouse to adjust the brightness and contrast of the image, and as the picture became clearer, Dr. Urian noticed something odd. Camilla's optic nerves, which connected her eyes to her brain, looked strangely bright, almost like they were painted to glow in the dark. Dr. Urian had never seen anything like this before, and he asked his team if any of them knew what this meant, and all of them shook their heads no. This was totally weird to them too. Unsure what else to do, the neurologist called the hospital's eye doctor, who told Dr. Urian to send Camilla right over for an exam. Just a few minutes after Camilla's eye exam, Dr. Urian, who was still in the radiology department looking over Camilla's MRI results, got a call back from the hospital's eye doctor. And he said something truly shocking. Camilla was almost totally blind. She had practically no vision at all in her right eye, and her left eye wasn't much better. Dr. Urian was speechless. Camilla had never said a word to her mother, her father, or grandmother about not being able to see. But the eye doctor told him that was actually pretty normal. Children Camilla's age often don't voice concerns about their vision because the way they see the world is kind of what's normal to them. They don't really know how they're supposed to see things yet. Dr. Urian thanked the doctor and hung up. He looked back at Camilla's MRI results, which now made a little more sense. Her optic nerves had somehow gotten damaged, and that's why they looked so strange on the MRI. Camilla was not gradually becoming clumsy and confused because of a brain tumor. The child literally couldn't see. But all of this didn't explain why Camilla had lost her vision or how they could preserve the eyesight she still had. Clearly, pressure had to be building up in Camilla's skull, Dr. Urian thought, but from what? If it wasn't due to bleeding, swelling, or a tumor, maybe it was from an infection. And so now, Dr. Urian wanted to do one more test, and he already knew Camilla and her whole family were not going to like it. Later that afternoon, Gabriella sat next to Joel and Camilla on the hospital bed. They'd been in the ER for hours. Camilla's cousins were all bored and tired, and Maria just flipped kind of mindlessly through TV channels, hoping to find something to keep the kids entertained. Meanwhile, Camilla's headaches were relentless. After her eye exam, she'd come back into the room and laid down with her eyes shut, and she'd barely moved since. Just then, Gabriella heard a knock at the door, and Dr. Urian came inside. He said he had some surprising news. The results from Camilla's eye exam showed that she was almost completely blind. Gabriella just stared at the doctor in shock. She thought back to the evening when Camilla couldn't figure out how to use her fork, and she realized her daughter wasn't playing games. She really could not see the food on her plate. All those times Camilla had seemed confused or bumped into things, it was because the whole world looked blurry to her. Gabriella couldn't believe she'd missed something that now seemed so obvious. She looked over at Joel, who seemed just as dumbfounded. But before Gabriella or Joel or Maria could ask any questions, Dr. Urian said he wanted to perform yet another test to figure out what was causing the girl's blindness. He said Camilla needed to undergo something called a spinal tap, which is a procedure where doctors insert a needle into the patient's spine and remove the sample of cerebrospinal fluid. Analyzing this fluid can help doctors diagnose brain infections. But at this point, Gabriella was starting to feel like her daughter was turning into a human pincushion. Camilla had already had a physical exam, 2 neurological exams, an eye exam, a CT scan, and an MRI with contrast. Now, Dr. Urian wanted to jab a needle into her daughter's spine? Gabriella wondered if this was too much for her daughter. But Dr. Urian promised the procedure might be scary sounding, but it was safe. Plus, it was necessary, because he still hadn't determined the cause of Camilla's terrible headaches, let alone her vision loss. Gabriella took a deep breath and said, "Okay, fine," as Joel wrapped an arm around her shoulders for support. A few minutes later, a different doctor came into the room to perform the spinal tap. He instructed Camilla to lie sideways on the bed and curl up into a ball. Gabriella held her daughter's hand tightly as the doctor cleaned Camilla's lower back and gave her a numbing shot. Then the doctor inserted a long, thin needle into Camilla's spine. The needle was attached to a syringe, and as the doctor pulled the stopper backwards, the syringe slowly filled with clear fluid. The doctor removed the needle, placed a bandage on Camilla's back, and said they would send her spinal fluid to the lab for analysis right away. Then the doctor left the room, and Gabriella loosened her grip on her daughter's hand. About 45 minutes later, Dr. Urian was in his office when he received the results of Camilla's spinal tap. There was no unusual bacteria in her spinal fluid, which ruled out the possibility of a brain infection. But the results also showed that the pressure inside of her head and spinal column was dangerously high, 2.5 times the normal level. This confirmed what Dr. Urian had already concluded, but he still didn't know where the pressure was coming from. All he knew was that there was no evidence of the usual causes of brain swelling. And yet, the pressure inside of Camilla's head was so high that it had damaged her optic nerves and caused her to lose her vision. And as Dr. Urian thought this over, he suddenly remembered that there was actually a name for this condition. It was called a pseudotumor cerebri. This meant Camilla had many of the symptoms associated with a brain tumor, but didn't actually have a tumor. This condition was so rare, especially in children, that Dr. Urian had not even considered it until just now. Dr. Urian rushed back to Camilla's hospital room and told her family about her diagnosis. He said pseudotumors can be caused by a variety of things, and he needed their help to figure out what caused this one in Camilla. The neurologist asked the family again if she took any medications or if there was any way she could have taken somebody else's medication by accident. Camilla's mother, father, and grandmother all said no, there was no way. Dr. Urian didn't want to offend Camilla's guardians by continuing to press them, so he printed out a list of all the possible causes of Camilla's condition and gave it to her family. Her mother, father, and grandmother quickly began to look over this list, and before long, the doctor noticed Camilla's grandmother, Maria, her expression completely changed. Her eyes widened as she stared at the sheet, and then she looked up at him in a total panic. Maria said she might know what made Camilla sick, but she would have to go all the way home to the Bronx to get it. While Maria traveled to and from New York, Joel took his nieces and nephews back to his and Gabriella's small apartment, and Gabriella stayed with their daughter at the hospital. Dr. Urian kept an eye on Camilla and worked to try to reduce the pressure inside of her head by draining more fluid from her spine and giving her special medications. and little by little, Camilla did start feeling better. The next day, Maria returned from the Bronx, and she sheepishly handed Dr. Urian a small bottle. She said her granddaughter's illness was definitely all her fault. Then the doctor read the label on the bottle she handed him, and all of Camilla's symptoms suddenly made sense. The bottle that Maria gave the doctor contained fish oil supplements, which are rich in omega-3 fatty acids, as well as vitamins A and D. Maria took these supplements religiously. She believed they strengthened her heart and also reduced her pain from arthritis. And when Camilla stayed with her grandmother in the Bronx every other month, Maria gave her 1 pill a day too. But when Dr. Urian looked at the bottle, he realized these fish oil pills were not formulated for kids. They were made for adults. So every time Camilla took one, she was getting 3 times the recommended dose of vitamin A for a child her age. That much vitamin A can wreak havoc on a young person's body and lead to irreversible organ damage. And in this case, it caused pressure to build up inside of Camilla's head, which then caused her to lose her vision and develop constant, debilitating headaches. Obviously, from this point forward, nobody in this family gave Camilla any more fish oil, which halted any further damage to Camilla's eyesight and nervous system. And while Camilla did luckily regain some of her vision, her eyesight was, unfortunately, permanently altered. She's now able to live a relatively normal life with the help of glasses and contact lenses, but she still does get the occasional headache. Officer named Derek was dumped by his longtime girlfriend. This breakup caught him by surprise because he had actually just recently moved to Colorado in order to be closer to his girlfriend. So naturally, he was devastated. After a few weeks of being so depressed and kind of just moping around and going through the motions in his life at this point, one of his very close friends suggested to him, like, hey man, look, why don't you just make a profile on Tinder, the online dating service, and just put yourself out there again. You have no idea who's out there. Clearly, your ex-girlfriend was not the one. Derek had met his ex-girlfriend in a bar, and every other girlfriend he had ever had, he had met in person. So online dating was definitely not on his radar. But he was so lonely and sad, he figured, you know what? I got nothing to lose. And so he made himself a Tinder profile. Derek quickly matched with a woman on Tinder named Leah that he said was way out of his league, but he wasn't complaining. They chatted for a couple of weeks and they got on great. And so they wanted to get together and actually meet each other in person. But Leah lived well over an hour away from Derek, so there wasn't a natural meeting place. And they're going back and forth about where they want to go. And finally, Leah just says, hey, why don't you just come to my town? There's this great park that I go running in all the time, and they have this awesome field that's on a slope, and you can lay on it and look up through the trees and you can see the stars. And so that would be a cool thing to do on our first date, go stargazing together. So the date night finally came, and Derek was really excited. He was nervous too, because even though they talked on the phone, this is the first time they're gonna see each other. And so the plan was he was gonna drive out to her town and actually pick her up from her work. She worked at a hair salon, and from there they would make their way over to this park. And so Derek pulls up to the hair salon right as Leah is coming outside, and she's all excited and she's waving to him. She runs over and she gets in the car and they hug and kiss on the cheek. And it's like they knew each other, but they didn't know each other because their entire relationship was online or via texting or a phone call. And so it's like they had history, but they didn't. But either way, Derek was really happy, and it seemed like Leah was too. From the hair salon, it was a pretty short drive to this access road that was going to bring them into this park. And when Leah told him to make this turn, it didn't look like a very well marked trail or even a marked park. It looked like this kind of random access road that Derek would not have associated with a big public park, but he doesn't know the area, and so he turns and he starts heading down this road, and the road went from cement to dirt pretty quickly, and this whole time he's thinking to himself, like, did I take a wrong turn? Does she know like where she's going? This does not feel like the way you drive into a big park, the way she was describing. Finally, they land back on cement, and they're actually on this road that's right up against this huge field. And so right away, Derek's stress is gone because now it's confirmed in his mind that, okay, that's a weird way to get into this park, but here's this huge, amazing field, and we're back on a real road, and everything's good again. Derek asked Leah, where should I park? Because they're on this really narrow road, and there didn't appear to be a parking lot. There also didn't appear to be anybody else on this field or on this road. It's this huge, open, beautiful space, but it did not look well populated or like it was well traveled. But she said, just go right up there. There's a small lot you can pull into. And so Derek starts going up this road and he sees maybe 300 feet ahead of him are dim headlights of another car making their way down the road towards him. And now it was dark enough that he couldn't really make out what kind of vehicle it was. And so he didn't know if it was going to be some big truck or something like that. And so what he did is he just pulled over as far to the side of the road as he could to allow this vehicle to pass, even though there was a fair amount of distance they would need to cover before they were passing him. He figured just give them the right of the road. And so as they start moving forward, he can see that it's actually this big van and they're moving pretty slowly. And he's just kind of waiting for them to pass. And he's not thinking anything of this. He's thinking that this is just another person at the park. And this van, instead of passing him, actually turns at the last second and almost goes bumper to bumper with Derek's car. He doesn't crash into it, but he stops just in front of Derek's car. And so Derek is a cop. He's a brand new cop. And he's super aggressive. You know, he really believes in his training. And so as soon as this guy stopped in front of him and blocked the path for him, red flags are going up for Derek and he knows something's wrong with this van. And instinctively, he says, Leah, stay here. He grabs his flashlight that he kept right in the center console and he jumped out of the car and went right to the driver's side door of this van to confront this guy. And when he got up to the driver's side door, it was this really big guy who looked pretty startled to see Derek come charging up to him with his flashlight. And Derek's like, what are you doing, man? What are you blocking me in for? And the guy's like, oh, hey, sorry, I'm the caretaker here of this whole property. And we've had an issue with poachers in the area. And I was concerned you guys were poachers. It doesn't look like you're poachers, though. And Derek's like, no, we're not poachers. We're going stargazing. I'm on my first date here. And the caretaker's like, I am so sorry. Please get back in your car, go and enjoy your night. And at that, he backed up, did a 3-point turn, and drove right back up that road where he came from and disappeared down on the other side of the hill. Derek stood in front of his car for a couple of minutes, making sure this guy was gone. And then he turned around and he got back in the car and he kind of joked with Leah. And he's like, yeah, he thought we were poachers. I guess you look like a poacher to him. And that's why he stopped us. But when he looked over at Leah to react to his hilarious joke, she wasn't paying attention to him. She was just furiously typing away on her phone, which Derek did think was a little bit odd. You'd think that she'd be more interested in this strange thing that just happened. Some weird guy just blocked us in and I'm confronting him. You'd think she'd be interested in that on some level. She might want to know what I said to the guy and what he said to me, but she didn't seem to care. She was just really invested in whoever she was typing on her phone. And so Derek thinks, whatever, and just throws the car back in drive and continues up the trail the way they were going before they were stopped. So Derek continues down the road just a little ways until he sees a little dirt lot that's butted up against this huge field they're going to be hanging out on for the night. And so he pulls into the lot, backs into his space, and he and Leah get out and they put a blanket out right next to the car, but on the grass on the hill. And they get their food out and their wine out and they sit down and very quickly they start swapping stories and they're laughing and they're stargazing and they're having some wine and everything's really great. After about an hour, it's totally dark outside and Derek is laying on the hill facing back towards his car and towards the road they were on. And he notices to his left up at the top of the hill, so the same area where the van had come from originally and where it went back to after they spoke that one time. Derek is looking out there and he sees headlights and it's the van. And now the van is driving down the road, not leisurely like it was before, but they are flying down the hill. And before Derek or Leah have a chance to react to this van barreling down on them, it comes flying into the parking lot and practically hits his car and comes to a stop where it's boxed his car in. So even if he got in his car, he couldn't drive away. And so Derek jumps up, Leah jumps up, and the guy, the caretaker, the nice caretaker he talked to before, he hops out of the driver's seat and he walks around the front of the van. He's got this pipe in his hand and he looks at Derek and he's like, give me your keys and your wallet. And again, Derek is this brand new cop. You know, he's 21 years old. He's not about to let this guy push him around. And so he doesn't do anything at first. He doesn't know what he's going to do, but he doesn't do anything at first. He just looks at this guy and he shows him that I'm not just going to fall over because he told me to. But then Derek is given a huge curveball when Leah, his date, stands up and runs over to this guy and stands next to him and turns around and looks at Derek and goes, come on, give us your keys and wallet. And Derek's like, great, I'm getting set up by my date who I've spent the past 2 hours with, I had a connection with this girl. And so now Derek is just standing there doing nothing, not to be tough, but because he's in shock. He feels so betrayed by Leah, and he just feels like, how could this have happened? And in that moment, Leah walks to the back of the van, and she gets a metal pipe. She comes back around, and she goes, Derek, give us your keys and your wallet. We don't want to have to hurt you. And this is when Derek looks at them both, and he goes, no. And as soon as he said that, the big guy tackles him. He gets thrown to the ground, but Derek could handle himself, and very quickly he was able to get up, and he drew his concealed carry pistol, and he's aiming it at the big guy and then back at Leah, and he's like, yeah, I'm a cop. Go ahead and put your hands up now. As soon as they saw the gun, they both dropped their pipes and put their hands up. And so as he's holding them both at gunpoint, and he's looking over at Leah like, really? You did this to me? Are you kidding me right now? As he's doing that, he has to get his cell phone out of his pocket, type in 911, and then called dispatch and had to say who he was, what his badge number was, what happened, and where he is. And where he is was difficult to describe. And so as he's trying to explain these directions, and he's saying, yo, yep, go left at the light, and then there's a gas station there, and you're gonna go up this field, you're gonna see me, I got these two people at gunpoint. As he's doing that, Leah and the caretaker look at each other, and they just turn around and bolt. They figure he's distracted, we can at least get behind the van and run into the forest before he's going to catch us. And so instinctively, he takes off running after them, and he chases them for about 30 seconds into the tree line before he starts hearing gunshots. And they weren't his, someone's shooting at him, and he sees the muzzle flash out in the middle of the forest, and he's like, yeah, I'm not doing this. He turns around, runs back to his vehicle, he starts it up, and he has to basically smash into the van, back into the fence over and over again, like Austin Powers, like a 25-point turn, before he was barely able to grind his way out and peel out of this park. And so Derek pulls into the nearest gas station. He calls up dispatch and he says, hey, I just called 911 like 5-10 minutes ago, and I dropped the call because I was chasing somebody. Here's my name, here's my badge number. I'm now at this gas station. Can you send a couple of police officers over to my location now? And they said, yep, we'll send some to you. And so a police cruiser shows up with 2 officers inside that Derek recognized. They were senior to him, and they got out, and he explained again what happened, and they kind of gave him a hard time for getting catfished on his very first date, but at the same time, they knew it could have gone really badly. And so they decide they're going to load up in the police cruiser together, all 3 of them, and drive back up to the park. And so they get up to the park, and Derek points ahead and he goes, that's the van, it's still here. And so they drive up and they stop short of the van. And the 2 uniformed officers, they turn to Derek and they're like, just stay in here. We're going to go check this van out. And so Derek's sitting in the car watching these guys go up to the vehicle, guns drawn. They're looking all around. They're clearing behind the vehicle. They're looking in the wood line. There's nobody there. And at some point he sees them put their pistols away and they go in the van. They're kind of shining with their flashlights all around. They're looking in the back, looking in the front. And then after a few minutes, they walked back to the cruiser. And as soon as they got in, Derek could tell there was just something off about how they were acting. When they were down at the gas station, they were kind of joking around with him. Now, whatever they had seen in the van was definitely not something they were going to joke about. And they turned to him and they're like, the back of the van, it was just knives and saws and pistols and rifles and lighter fluid and chains and handcuffs and duct tape. It was just awful, and it looks like there might even be blood on the ground. The 2 officers immediately called in additional backup, and before long, it was a full-fledged circus around this van of a crime scene investigation unit and other police officers, spotlights set up, and they went out looking in the woods for these people, but they never found the guy, they never found the girl, and Derek would tell the other investigators, hey, she works at this hair salon, like right down the road, I picked her up there. And so they went over to the hair salon and they wound up talking to the people there, and they said, we've never heard of Leah. And when they showed them a picture of Leah, they were like, we've never seen her before. And so they came back and they told Derek, look, she's a con artist. And this whole thing, your whole relationship with her has been her setting you up in some way, shape, or form. The entire thing. That's all it ever was. And so for Derek, that was crushing, and he swore off Tinder immediately. He did not want to do any more online dating. But what really haunts him more than just being taken advantage of is, what would have happened if I wasn't concealed carrying? Would I have wound up in the back of that van? In the summer of 2019, a grandmother named Barbara was looking after her grandkids for the weekend while her daughter and her husband were out of town. Her daughter had 3 kids, 2 that were under the age of 6 and 1 who was 15 years old, and her name was Alyssa. And so anytime Barbara was looking after her grandkids for longer than just a single day, like if she was taking care of them overnight, she would just stay at their house so as not to disrupt their lives more than she needed to. And so their house was a modest single-story home in a nice suburb of Dallas, Texas, where the crime rate is basically 0 and everybody in the neighborhood knows each other. And so this particular night that she's over there looking after them was like any other. She put the 2 young ones to bed first, and then she and Alyssa stayed up a little bit later in the kitchen chatting, talking about school, before ultimately both of them went to bed. So because their house is a single-story home, all the bedrooms are on the only floor of the house. And so Barbara and Alyssa's room were right next to each other, looking out to the side of the property. And so as soon as Barbara got in her room, she opened up the window that was right next to her bed, because as a kid, she always slept with the window open. And even though her daughter's house had air conditioning, she preferred to keep the window open. So window's open, she has a screen that's in her window, and Barbara crawls into bed and she falls asleep. At about 3 a.m., Barbara wakes up to the sound of rustling coming from outside of her window. And so she hears it, but it sounds an awful lot like it's probably just a dog or a cat or some other animal that's in the area. It did not seem like a big deal to her, and she was just going to forget about it. But then she heard it again, and it sounded much more like footsteps, and they sounded heavy enough that it probably couldn't be a dog or a cat. And so she rolled over onto her elbows and she pulled the curtain aside just enough to look out the screen door. And so the moon was out, so there was pretty good illumination, and so she could clearly see the side of the house. She could see the side of the house, she could see the fence that separated their property and their neighbors, and then she could see the neighbor's house and all their lights are off. And she noticed propped up against the fence on their side of the fence, so on their property, was this bike that she didn't recognize. And she's looking at it thinking, is that Alyssa's bike? It's too big to be either of the 6-year-old's bikes. Whose bike is that? And as she's looking at the bike, she hears more rustling coming from the left, which is closer to Alyssa's room. Barbara presses her face up against the screen to try to look out the window towards the left, because whatever's making the sound is now out of her view. And as she's got her face pressed up against the screen trying to look, she sees a boy emerge from the bushes from right underneath Alyssa's room. He's got that high school Letterman jacket, like the classic, football jacket that high school kids wear. He comes out of the bushes wearing that, and he's got his hood pulled up, and he doesn't look over at her. He's just backing up away from Alyssa's room, and he's looking up into Alyssa's room. And so Barbara immediately thinks, okay, this guy is probably one of Alyssa's friends, maybe a boyfriend, I don't know. And Alyssa must have invited him over. Maybe she invited him when she knew her parents were going to be out of town, but before I said I was going to be here to look after them, and that message didn't get passed to him, and so he's here. All these scenarios are going through Barbara's head, but all she knew is she's not going to call the cops on some teenage kid that's coming to say hi to Alyssa. Instead, she's going to confront him, because Barbara was actually a high school teacher and had been for decades. And so she'd had lots of run-ins with badly behaved teenagers, and she was pretty good at standing her ground and being firm and kind of getting teenagers to listen to her. So she figured she would just go out there and be stern with him and he'd get the message. And so she quietly gets off of her bed. She walks out of her room to the front of the house. So he's over here, side of the house. She's going to the front of the house. She flips on the lights as soon as she's outside, and she quickly walks around to the edge of the porch where she can poke her head over and see right down the side of the house where this kid's going to be. So she pokes her head over and she goes, "Can I help you?" And this kid turns and looks at her for the first time, and immediately Barbara's like, oh, whoa. He is not a teenager. He looks like he's in his 20s, if not 30s. No matter what, he is a lot older than Alyssa. And it caught her so off guard, she didn't really know how to react to it. She was just looking at this guy who looks so much older, but he's got a bike and he's wearing a Letterman jacket. And so Barbara's a little bit confused. And so she's thinking to herself, okay, it's possible that he could just be one of those kids that looks a lot older than he really is. But somewhere in the back of her mind, she's thinking, this doesn't feel right. This feels like a grown man is trying to get into the house. And so as she's thinking about this, she's also registering that this guy, he seems completely unfazed. He's just looking up at her, and he actually starts taking steps towards her to the point where Barbara says, stop where you are. And he does. And he looks up at her and he says, I'm looking for Alyssa. Is she home? And so as Barbara is just glaring at this guy, hoping that will be enough to get him to leave, but he's not leaving, it occurs to her that this could be a misunderstanding. And so thinking on her feet, she says to him, who did you say you're looking for? Lisa? Without any hesitation, he goes, no, I'm looking for Alyssa McCarran. She lives here. Barbara went silent for a second because he was right. That was her name, and she certainly was here. But she did not want him coming anywhere near the house until she had a chance to talk to Alyssa and confirm that she had invited him here, or at the very minimum, that she knew who he was. And so Barbara says to the guy, I need you to stay right there. It's 3 a.m. I don't know you. Give me a minute. I'll be right back. And he appears to get the message. And so Barbara went back inside the house. She shut and locked the door behind her. And then she went into Alyssa's room and she shook her foot to wake her up. And so Alyssa kind of sits up and she's looking around and she's like, what's going on? And Barbara looks at her and she's kind of annoyed with how the night's gone. And at this point, she's kind of blaming Alyssa for probably having invited this strange creep over to their house in the middle of the night. And she says to Alyssa, did you invite a boy here tonight? And Alyssa's like, no, what are you talking about? Barbara narrowed her eyes and she said, Well, there's a boy outside that clearly knows you. He asked for you by name, and he knows you live here, and he's outside right now. Can you please go out there and tell him that coming over unannounced at 3 in the morning is not very polite, and he shouldn't do it again? Alyssa's confused, and she's looking at her grandmother like, what are you talking about? And so she leans back and she opens the curtain of her window and she looks outside, and immediately she pulls her head back in and she says, Grandma, he asked for me by name? And Barbara's like, yeah, he said Alyssa McCarran lives here. And Alyssa's like, we have to call 911. I've never seen him before in my life. Suddenly, everything made sense for Barbara. This was a stranger. This is not a friend. This is probably a grown man, and he was probably trying to break into Alyssa's room. And so as she's having this realization, they both hear footsteps out on the front porch. And at this, Barbara goes into full protective grandmother mode, and she tells Alyssa, stay in your bed, do not move. And Barbara runs out of her room. She goes into her bedroom, and she shuts that window and locks it, and then runs to the front of the house to make sure that door was locked, because she thought she locked it when she came in, but she wasn't 100% sure. She gets right in front of it, and she can see that it's locked. And now she's standing right on the other side of the door, kind of waiting to see what's going to happen. And this guy is standing on the porch, but obscured. She can't see him because he's on the other side of the door. And it's silent for a second. And as she's standing there just waiting for something to happen, she hears knocking on the door. And it startled her when she heard it, and she yelled out, there's no Alyssa McCarran here. You have the wrong house. You need to leave or I'm calling the police. And the knocking stops for a second, and he says, I know Alyssa lives here. Tell her to come outside. He goes back to knocking, and Barbara picks up her phone and she calls 911, and she intentionally talks really loudly into the phone, making it very obvious she is calling the police. And very clearly this guy picked up on what Barbara was doing, because the knocking stopped and she saw him through the little slit of glass next to the door run to the left of the house, back towards the side where his bike was. And so Barbara, while on the phone, runs into the bedroom where she was sleeping, and she looks out the side window, and the last she sees of this guy is riding his bike across the street. And then he stops next to an SUV, and he opens a trunk and he throws the bike in the trunk, and he gets in the passenger side of the car and they drive off, which means whatever he had planned to do with Alyssa or whatever he was doing this night, he had an accomplice. The police show up a couple minutes later, and at this point, this creep and whoever he was with are long gone, but Barbara still gives her description of the vehicle and description of the night and what happened. And the police told her that over the past couple of weeks, they've gotten very similar reports from other households where there are young girls inside of the house. Apparently, this boy was actually a grown man that would use social media to figure out where kids lived, and then he would dress up like a teenager, and then he would go stalk them. And so whatever Alyssa had listed online, he had been able to deduce that she lived there, and who knows how long he had been looking in the window at her at night. In 2018, an up-and-coming Instagram influencer named Wendy was contacted by a hotel in Miami, Florida that wanted to see if she'd be willing to stay at their property over Memorial Day weekend. They said they were willing to cover all of her expenses as long as she was willing to post a couple of times while she was at the hotel, showing off how great the hotel was. They also told her to bring along a female friend, and that friend, they would cover all of her expenses as well. Even though Wendy didn't know if she had any girl friends that would want to do this with her, she was so eager to take them up on this opportunity because she was trying to make being an influencer be her full-time job. And so opportunities like this were huge for her. And so she said yes, even before she knew if she could bring along a friend like they asked her to. And so sure enough, over the next couple of days, as she reached out to her network to see if there's any females that wanted to come with her, everybody was either busy or wasn't that interested, or they had plans. And so since she did not want to cancel, she thought, well, it can't be that big of a deal if I bring along a male friend. And so she reached out to her good friend Mitch, who's this 6'4" athletic guy who was just one of her close friends. And she said, hey, would you mind coming along with me to this thing in Miami over Memorial Day weekend? I need someone to go with me. They asked for a female, but you're gonna have to do. And so Mitch agreed to do it, and Wendy thought to herself, well, worst case scenario is they're not willing to pay for Mitch's, expenses, and that she would pay for them, and she told Mitch as much. And so they thought that was just fine. They figured that was a good solution. And so the day arrives, and Wendy and Mitch are really excited about this trip. They don't often get to go travel around as influencers. And so they hop on a plane, they fly first class to Miami. When they get there, they go down, they get their bags at a baggage claim, and then they go out to the curb, and right away, Wendy sees there's this really well-dressed guy with dark sunglasses on, and he's holding up a sign that has her last name on it and the logo of the hotel on it. And so she waves to him and walks over, and Mitch is following right behind. And this guy looks at her and he says, okay, well, where's your friend? And that's when she says, oh, well, actually, I brought Mitch because none of my girlfriends wanted to go. So I brought Mitch along. And so this guy lowers his sunglasses and he looks at Mitch and he kind of looks up and down. Then he puts his sunglasses back and he turns and he walks towards this beautiful black SUV that's parked right up against the curb. And so Wendy and Mitch follow him, and this guy opens up the back door and Wendy and Mitch get in. The guy takes their luggage and puts it in the back of the vehicle and shuts it. And as soon as Wendy and Mitch sit inside of this car, the driver is visibly upset. He's kind of ranting and raving, and the front passenger window was down. And so Wendy and Mitch assumed he must be yelling at someone outside of the vehicle, like this guy that had just picked them up. He must be communicating with him somehow. He can't possibly be yelling at us. We just got here. We don't know him. But sure enough, as they kind of are tuning into what he's saying, he has a very thick accent, and he's saying, "Where is the other girl? You're not supposed to have a guy. It's two girls, not one girl, one guy. It's two girls. Where is the other girl?" As Wendy is hearing this, she feels so uncomfortable, not just for herself, but for Mitch too, because she asked him to come along and had said, oh, it won't be a big deal. They won't mind. But clearly they do mind. And so Wendy's trying to explain to the driver that, I know you asked for a female friend, but I didn't have a female friend. And so I brought him along. I will pay for him. I'm not asking you guys to pay for him. I'll pay for everything that he touches. I'll pay for his hotel, his flight, everything. But the driver didn't seem that upset about who was paying for Mitch. His frustration came from a place of being frustrated, like they weren't going to be able to do whatever they had planned to do because now Mitch is in the mix. And so as Wendy and the driver are kind of going back and forth and the driver's getting more and more frustrated, the guy that had originally greeted Wendy and Mitch hopped in the front seat, and he and the driver started arguing with each other in Portuguese. And so for about a minute, Wendy and Mitch are looking at each other like, what is going on here? And these guys are yelling at each other, and then they stop, and the driver turns around again, and one more time he says to Wendy, where is the other girl? And Wendy says, there is no other girl. It is Mitch and I. That is it. At this point, the driver makes a sound like he was disgusted with both of them, and he raises his hand up like this, and he turns to face the road in front of him. And the guy that had originally greeted Wendy and Mitch, he gets out of the passenger seat, goes around to the back, opens the back of the truck, takes their luggage out, throws it onto the curb, goes to the door that is closest to Mitch, opens it up, and he tells them to get out. And so Wendy and Mitch climb back out onto the curb. The guy shuts the door behind them. He hops back in the front seat, and that car peels away. That was it. At this point, Wendy's thinking to herself, I bet those two guys have nothing to do with the hotel and the people that I had been communicating with to set this whole thing up. I bet they are just the drivers, and they were told to pick up two girls, and we showed up with a girl and a guy, and it screwed them up, and they got mad, and they got really mad, I guess, and then they left. And so I bet if I can just get in touch with the people at the hotel, the people I had spoken to, that they can clear this whole thing up. And so she opens up her email and she sends a message to Marissa, who was one of the people at the hotel that she had been going back and forth with when she was buying her plane ticket. And then she sent another message to the Instagram account that had over 10,000 followers that she had been going back and forth with quite a bit, that had actually originally reached out to her. And so for a couple of minutes, Wendy is watching her phone, waiting for a response. And at some point, Mitch says to her, by the time we get a response to either your, Instagram DM or your email, we probably could have just taken an Uber over to the hotel and spoken to them directly. So why don't we just go do that? And so they agree, they hop in an Uber and they drive the short distance to this hotel. And as soon as they get out, Wendy notices something that at the time did not seem like a big deal, which was the logo of the hotel, the one in real life right in front of her. It was a little bit different than the one that is on the Instagram page, the one she'd been talking back and forth with. That was their profile picture. It's different than the one in real life. And so that stood out to her just because she had looked at that page a number of times. But it was definitely the same hotel, and so she didn't think much of it. And she and Mitch walked inside right up to the front desk, and Wendy asked to speak with a manager. And shortly thereafter, a manager comes out and she asks Wendy and Mitch to come into her office. They go inside and she says, okay guys, what's going on? What do you need? And so Wendy explains the framework of the deal she had negotiated with Marissa. And she said, look, when I got to the airport, the guys that picked us up were incredibly rude and they wouldn't give us a ride here. And I just want to let you know what happened. We don't care. We got a ride here, but we just figured you should know. And the woman looks at her kind of puzzled and she says, who was the person you talked to? You said Marissa? And Wendy's like, yeah, Marissa. She's the marketing person here. And the manager looks at her and she says, no, I'm the marketing person and my name's Kelly. I think you're at the wrong hotel. because we don't have any influencers that are here right now, and I would have known about this. Wendy can't believe it, and she pulls up the Instagram page she's been talking to, and she shows it to the manager. And the manager takes it, and she's pretty surprised by what she's looking at, and she's like, this is our old account. We deleted this, or I thought we deleted this. We have a new one because we rebranded. We have a brand new logo, everything's new, and we just felt like we'd start fresh. So I don't know who owns this account now, but that is our account. It's just, we don't use it anymore. I don't know how anyone got a hold of it. At this point, it clicked for Wendy that this whole thing was a facade, that this whole time she was being conned, and what really scared her is, to what end? What were they trying to do with her? Had she shown up with the other female friend, what would they have done with her? But at this moment, Wendy just feels totally overwhelmed by the entire moment. She's so embarrassed that she thought this was real, and she dragged Mitch along, and this whole thing was just fake. She's so embarrassed that she just approached this manager who basically said, that's all fake. And so she just wanted to leave. And so she stands up and she says, I'm really sorry for wasting your time, to the manager, and she and Mitch leave. She goes outside and she just sits down and she's crying. And Mitch says, hey, you really ought to call the police and let them know this happened, because, clearly there were plans for you, and, had you brought a female friend, and they can't have been good plans. I think you need to let the police know that this scam exists. And so Wendy does call the police, and she explains what happened, and she's surprised when they say, hey, where are you right now? We'd love to send a detective over to you to talk to you a little bit more about what happened. And so Wendy tells them where they are, and she's a little bit surprised that they want to send a detective over to talk about this, because in her mind, this isn't that big of a deal. I mean, it's a big deal to her and to Mitch, but nothing really happened. But either way, they go sit on the bench right outside the hotel, and they wait for the detective to show up. And just a couple of minutes later, he does. He walks up, he introduces himself, and he says, hey, let's go inside and grab a table and we can chat. And so they go inside and they sit down, and Wendy and Mitch go over their story one more time. And after they're done, the detective says, look, I don't mean to scare you, but I do want you to understand just how serious of a situation you guys were just in. So in Miami, human traffickers use these phony hotel Instagram accounts to attract young women like yourself to Miami in order to be trafficked. And so they will buy these old business Instagram accounts from companies that have either rebranded or who are going out of business. They'll pay top dollar to acquire those Instagram accounts. And then they will use them in order to get people like you to come to Miami. And so probably the only reason they didn't follow through on their operation is because you brought Mitch along, who posed a threat to them. And so that's why they were upset with you, and that's why they decided it wasn't worth it. So even though this must have been incredibly traumatic for you, I'm sure you were spared a much worse fate.